The once vibrant skyline of New Chicago lay under a blanket of eerie silence. Streets that had been bustling with life were now cracked and overgrown with weeds, buildings stood hollow like empty shells, and the hum of daily life had been replaced by the occasional creak of metal and distant wind whistling through broken windows. The world had changed, but for Ethan, this was only the beginning. Ethan crouched behind a rusted car, his breath shallow and steady. His eyes scanned the deserted street ahead, alert for any sign of movement. The city was a graveyard, but not all dangers were buried beneath its debris. The dead weren't resting. Somewhere out there, in the shadows of this abandoned metropolis, something stirred. For months, news of the outbreak had filtered through in scattered reports, a strange illness spreading rapidly, transforming the infected into relentless pursuers of the living. But no one really knew how it began. The government had fallen silent, and emergency broadcasts were replaced by static. Communities dissolved overnight, leaving survivors to fend for themselves. Ethan had been a photographer before all this started, someone who loved capturing moments of life. Now, those moments were scarce and precious. His camera, once a tool for art, had become a weapon of sorts, a means to document the truth of what remained. But survival required more than memories. It demanded sharp instincts and ruthless caution. His only companion was a small radio device, crackling with faint voices from other survivors scattered across the country. The static was sometimes overwhelming, but today, a voice had broken through, a call for help from an unknown location several miles east. With a final glance at the empty streets, Ethan rose and moved cautiously toward the city center. Every step was measured, every sound analyzed. The city had become a maze of shadows and uncertainty, where trust was a dangerous currency, and silence often meant something more sinister. As he reached the edge of a crumbling plaza, he noticed fresh footprints in the dust, signs that others were nearby. Not just survivors, but something else. The marks were too deep and erratic to be human alone. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic would only give away his position. Suddenly, a faint noise echoed from an alleyway, a low, guttural sound, barely more than a whisper. Ethan froze. The sound was unmistakable. The creatures were close. He retreated into the shadows, slipping silently between buildings, guided by instinct and years of training in urban exploration. Every corner he turned revealed new evidence of the collapse: overturned cars, hastily abandoned belongings, signs of struggle. The city was a puzzle he had to piece together, but the most important clue was the growing presence of the undead. They were no longer just rumors, they were hunting in packs, using the ruins as their domain. Ethan's mind raced. He thought of his family, of the last message from his sister, a hope that still flickered in his chest despite the desolation. He needed to find safe ground, a place untouched by the chaos. Somewhere he could regroup, plan his next move, and maybe find others willing to fight back. Night was falling, and the city's shadows grew longer, swallowing everything in darkness. The creatures were more active at night, and the risk of detection increased with every step he took. Then, a sudden crack shattered the quiet, a window breaking somewhere behind him. Ethan spun around, heart racing. The street was empty, but he could hear shuffling footsteps growing louder. There was no time to hide. He sprinted toward an old fire escape, climbing swiftly as the noises followed below. From his vantage point, he saw the horde gather, a mass of broken, twitching bodies, their movements erratic but purposeful. They searched for any sign of life, and tonight, Ethan was the prey. He held his breath, watching as the undead lost interest and moved on. The danger was constant, unyielding, and yet Ethan refused to let fear consume him. He had survived this long by staying vigilant, and he would continue to do so. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan made his way to an old subway station, a place rumored to be a sanctuary for survivors. It was risky, but the only lead he had. Inside the station, the air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and forgotten hopes. He reached a worn bulletin board plastered with scraps of paper, notes, maps, and messages from others who had passed through. One note caught his eye, a simple message scrawled in hurried handwriting: "Help. Safe haven. East Terminal. Follow the river." Ethan folded the note carefully and tucked it into his jacket. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers lurking in every shadow. But for the first time in a long while, he had a direction, a faint glimmer of hope in the shadows of dead America. As he prepared to leave the subway behind, a sudden tremor shook the ground beneath him. The city was waking up, but so was the darkness. The nightmare was far from over. Ethan's journey had only just begun. Would you like me to continue with part 2? It will build on this momentum, revealing more about the dangers Ethan faces and introducing new characters and twists. The echo of footsteps reverberated off the damp subway walls as Ethan descended deeper into the bowels of the city. The flickering lights overhead cast long shadows, dancing like restless spirits in the darkness. The once bustling tunnels were now a labyrinth of silence, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional metallic groan of old infrastructure settling. The note in Ethan's pocket burned like a beacon of hope. Help. Safe haven. East Terminal. Follow the river. But he knew better than to trust promises in a world gone mad. Every safe haven he had heard of so far had turned into a trap, a graveyard, or worse. Still, without a plan, the alternative was wandering these dead streets alone, and that was a fate worse than any. As he moved cautiously through the tunnels, he paused near a faded mural on the wall. The paint was chipped and peeling, but the image was unmistakable, a family, smiling beneath a shining sun. It was a reminder of the world that had been lost, a stark contrast to the grim reality around him. Suddenly, a faint clatter echoed from a side passage. Ethan froze, listening intently. The sound repeated, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps or something rolling on the ground. He adjusted the strap of his pack, fingers tightening around the grip of his makeshift weapon, a sturdy metal pipe he'd scavenged days ago. Slowly, he edged toward the source of the noise, every sense alert. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to press his back against the cold wall. Ahead, a dim light flickered, casting an eerie glow. Peering around the corner, Ethan spotted a figure hunched over what looked like a small campfire. The stranger looked up sharply, eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the man lowered his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Name's Marcus," the man said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "You're not from around here, are you?" Ethan shook his head. "No. I'm looking for the East Terminal. Heard it might be safe." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're not the first to come asking. This place," he gestured broadly to the tunnels, "used to be a refuge for a few, but things change. People change." Curiosity overcame caution. "What happened?" Marcus sighed, looking down at the flickering flames. "Trust broke. Supplies ran low. Then came the raids. Desperation makes monsters of us all, and sometimes, the monsters aren't the ones who walk on two legs." Ethan's mind raced. The creatures outside were terrifying enough, but human threats were just as deadly. The line between friend and foe was blurred, and alliances fragile. Suddenly, a distant rumble shook the tunnel. Dust fell from the ceiling, and Marcus stiffened. "That's not good." Before Ethan could ask, a sharp banging echoed from the main entrance, heavy footsteps pounding closer, louder. The undead? Or worse, hostile survivors. Marcus grabbed Ethan's arm. "We don't have much time." They scrambled through a narrow passage, the sound of pursuit growing behind them. The tunnels twisted unpredictably, a maze of danger. Ethan's heart pounded, the weight of his pack a reminder of the long road ahead. Emerging into a side exit, the two men found themselves in a forgotten subway yard. Overgrown with vines and littered with abandoned train cars, it was a ghost of transportation's past glory. But safety was an illusion. From the shadows, a low growl rose, followed by snarls and shuffling footsteps. Ethan raised his pipe, ready. Marcus pulled a small knife from his belt. They stood back to back, preparing to face whatever came. The creatures appeared slowly, emerging from the darkness, gaunt figures with hollow eyes, their movements jerky but relentless. The horde was smaller than usual, but more focused, as if driven by a new force. The fight was brutal but brief. Ethan's strikes landed with desperate precision, Marcus's knife cutting swiftly through the thin air. When silence finally fell, the survivors were breathing hard, bloodied but alive. "We need to move," Marcus urged. "This yard is no place to linger." Together, they crossed the yard and approached a rusted gate marked East Terminal. Beyond it lay the river, their path to the safe haven promised in the note. But as Ethan pushed the gate open, a sudden noise made him freeze, a metallic clang, followed by the unmistakable hiss of a trap. A hidden net dropped from above, ensnaring Marcus. His startled cry echoed in the quiet. Ethan rushed to help, but before he could free his companion, shadows moved from the darkness, figures cloaked in tattered clothing, faces obscured. "We've been watching," a voice hissed. "Not many come this far. Even fewer leave." Ethan's grip tightened on his pipe. The tunnel had taught him one thing: trust no one. Especially not those who hid in the shadows. The strangers closed in, their intentions unclear, but deadly. Ethan glanced at Marcus, trapped but defiant, and knew this was only the beginning of a new fight. In the shadows of dead America, survival was more than a battle against the undead. It was a test of wits, courage, and the will to keep moving forward, even when hope was the rarest thing of all. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as the shadowy figures stepped closer, their intentions clear in the cold glint of their eyes. The net holding Marcus tight swayed slightly with his struggling movements, but the strangers made no effort to release him. Instead, they circled the two survivors like predators eyeing fresh prey. One stepped forward, a tall woman with sharp features, her gaze piercing through the dim light. "We're the gatekeepers," she said, voice low and steady. "We control this territory. Everyone who passes through must prove they belong." Ethan's grip tightened around his metal pipe, every instinct screaming to run. But escape wasn't an option. Behind the gatekeepers lay the river, the promise of the East Terminal Sanctuary. Ahead was only darkness and the undead. "Prove we belong?" Ethan repeated cautiously. "How?" The woman smiled, but it was a grim smile. "By answering a question. A test of trust. If you fail, you don't leave, not alive." Marcus scowled, still tangled in the net. "We're survivors, just like you. No reason to fight." The woman's gaze flicked to Marcus, then back to Ethan. "Survivors make choices. Choices that define them. The question is, who will you risk for? Yourself? Others? Or the dead?" The cryptic challenge unsettled Ethan. The line between friend and foe blurred here, thick with suspicion and desperation. He glanced at Marcus, who gave a barely perceptible nod. They were in this together. The gatekeepers led them through a narrow passage beyond the gate, into a hidden enclave carved out beneath the ruins. Flickering lanterns revealed a small community, survivors who had adapted to life underground, protected by walls of scavenged metal and steel. Despite the dim surroundings, a faint hum of life filled the space, whispered conversations, the clatter of tools, the distant laughter of children. It was a stark contrast to the desolation above. One of the gatekeepers, a younger man with a scar running down his cheek, approached Ethan. "If you want to stay, you have to pass the trial. We don't trust strangers easily. The dead aren't the only threat." Ethan felt the weight of unseen eyes on him. This was more than survival now, it was politics, alliances, and hidden dangers. He was no stranger to risk, but the cost here felt higher. The trial was simple in concept but brutal in execution, a scavenging mission into the city ruins. Each group sent to retrieve supplies had to face the undead, the unstable terrain, and sometimes other desperate survivors. Success meant acceptance, failure meant exile or worse. Ethan and Marcus exchanged a glance. They had no choice but to try. Before dawn, they were outfitted with weapons, maps, and a strict time limit. The mission was to retrieve medical supplies from an abandoned hospital near the river's edge, a place whispered to be crawling with danger. The city outside was colder, emptier than before. The sky overhead was a blanket of gray clouds, the light dim and unforgiving. Ethan's camera hung from his neck, a silent witness to the decay around him. As they crossed the cracked streets toward the hospital, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The silence was too complete, the shadows too deep. They moved swiftly, alert to every sound. Broken glass crunched beneath their boots, and the occasional distant groan of the undead sent chills down their spines. Arriving at the hospital, the heavy doors were rusted shut. Ethan and Marcus pried one open with a crowbar, the screech echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten pain. Flickering emergency lights cast ghostly glows on peeling walls. Medical equipment lay abandoned, and papers fluttered in the faint breeze. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs, a faint tapping, then shuffling footsteps. Ethan motioned for silence. They crept toward the staircase, senses sharp. As they ascended, they found a young woman huddled in a corner, clutching a torn blanket. Her eyes were wide with fear, but when she saw them, hope sparked. "I'm Sarah," she whispered. "I've been hiding here since it started." Ethan's heart softened. Even in this broken world, there were still stories waiting to be told, lives worth saving. Sarah led them to a locked supply room filled with bandages, antibiotics, and other crucial medical gear. The trio gathered what they could carry. But their return was not as smooth. The hospital's back exit was blocked by a growing horde, drawn by their noise. Trapped between the dead and the unknown, Ethan, Marcus, and Sarah prepared to fight their way through, every breath heavy with tension. Ethan glanced back once more at the city skyline, a haunting silhouette of a world lost to shadows. But even here, amidst ruin and death, the flicker of human courage burned bright. The trial was far from over. Ethan's heart pounded as the horde pressed closer, their ragged moans rising into a chilling chorus that filled the hospital's back exit. The sharp scent of decay mixed with dust and rust, suffocating in the stale air. The trio's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of their gathered supplies making every step heavier. "We need a plan," Marcus whispered, eyes scanning the narrow alley beyond the blocked exit. The walls on either side were crumbling, with piles of debris and twisted metal strewn across the ground. Sarah, still trembling but determined, pointed to a fire escape ladder hanging precariously from the side of the building. "We can climb up and cross the rooftops. It's risky, but it's the only way." Ethan studied the alley below. The undead were closing in fast, and turning back wasn't an option. He nodded sharply. "Then up we go." One by one, they scrambled to the ladder. The rusted metal groaned under their weight, each rung threatening to give way. Sarah went first, followed by Marcus, then Ethan, carrying the bulk of the supplies. Reaching the roof, the cold wind bit through their clothes. The city stretched out before them, a desolate maze of broken streets, shattered buildings, and forgotten hopes. The rooftops offered a temporary refuge, but the journey was far from over. Moving carefully, they hopped from one rooftop to the next, each leap a test of balance and nerve. The gaps between buildings were dangerous, and a misstep could mean a fatal fall. Halfway across, a sudden crack echoed beneath Ethan's foot. He froze as a loose section of the roof gave way, plunging him briefly into darkness before his hands found the ledge to catch himself. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled himself back up, sweat slick on his forehead. "Careful," Marcus hissed from a few feet away. Ethan nodded, swallowing his fear. Every step was a gamble now, survival a delicate balance between courage and caution. As they neared the final building, a figure appeared on a distant rooftop, a lone silhouette watching them from the shadows. Ethan's breath caught. Who was this watcher? Friend or foe? The figure disappeared before Ethan could react, leaving only a whisper of movement. They reached the east terminal at last, a fortified compound hidden beneath an old train station. Its towering walls, patched together with scavenged metal and wood, rose like a fortress against the decaying cityscape. A heavy gate creaked open, and the gatekeepers stood waiting, faces unreadable. Marcus stepped forward, hands raised to show they came in peace. "We made it." The gatekeepers inspected their supplies and then their faces softened slightly. The trial was over, but the story was far from finished. Inside the compound, Ethan finally allowed himself a moment of rest. The air buzzed with the quiet activity of survivors rebuilding, adapting, and clinging to life amid the ruins. But as night fell, an uneasy feeling settled over Ethan. The shadows here felt heavier, filled with secrets waiting to surface. The gatekeeper's warning echoed in his mind, the dead aren't the only threat. And somewhere in the darkness, the Watcher's eyes were still watching. The safe walls of the East Terminal felt like a fragile barrier against the chaos outside. But as Ethan settled into the cramped quarters, the unease lingering in the shadows refused to fade. The gatekeepers had welcomed them, but their cautious glances and whispered conversations told a different story. Ethan noticed at first during the evening gathering, survivors huddled around small fires, exchanging stories laced with fear and suspicion. The quiet glances directed at Marcus and Sarah made it clear, newcomers were still outsiders here, no matter what trials they'd passed. A stern-faced elder approached Ethan, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You survived the trial, but survival here demands more than courage. Trust is earned, and secrets have weight." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, a sudden alarm shattered the night's fragile calm. The warning bells clanged sharply, echoing through the compound. The gatekeepers sprang into action. "Zombies at the perimeter," one shouted. The walls were being tested. Ethan grabbed his weapon as chaos erupted around him. Shouts and footsteps filled the air, the sound of makeshift barricades being reinforced. He raced toward the outer walls with Marcus and Sarah close behind. From the battlements, Ethan saw the horde massing again, their groans like a dark tide pressing against the gate. But something was different this time, a few figures moved at the edge of the group, slower, more deliberate. "Look!" Sarah pointed to shadows shifting behind the undead. "Those aren't just zombies." Ethan squinted. Among the staggering bodies, some survivors lurked, cloaked and cautious, blending with the dead. They weren't attacking openly, but their presence spelled deeper trouble. "Scavengers," Marcus muttered grimly. "They use the zombies as cover. If they breach the walls, we're done for." The gatekeepers prepared to defend fiercely, but Ethan's mind raced. The outsiders weren't just a threat to the walls, they represented something darker, betrayal from within the ruins of humanity. When the attack finally ended, the compound's defenders had held their ground. But the price was clear, a breach in trust. Back inside, Ethan met with the gatekeeper's leader, the woman who had first challenged them. "You understand now," she said quietly. "The world outside isn't just dead bodies and empty streets. It's filled with those who've lost their way, and those who've chosen to prey on others." Ethan nodded, the weight of the harsh new reality settling in. "What happens now?" "We watch. We prepare. And we decide who's truly part of this community, and who isn't." That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. Trust was a fragile thing, more fragile than the walls holding back the dead. In a world of shadows and ghosts, survival wasn't just about fighting zombies, it was about facing the darkness in people's hearts. And somewhere in the distance, the Watcher's eyes glinted once again, unseen but never far. Want to keep the story going with part 6? The mystery around the Watcher and the internal tensions will deepen. The days that followed felt heavy with unspoken threats. Inside the East Terminal, the survivors moved with wary steps, their eyes flicking to shadows as if expecting danger at every turn. The uneasy truce with the gatekeepers barely masked the tension threading through the community. Ethan found himself drawn to the rooftop where the Watcher had appeared before. He scanned the ruined skyline, searching for any sign of the mysterious figure. But the city remained silent, a grim, motionless graveyard. That night, as Ethan patrolled the perimeter with Marcus and a handful of gatekeepers, the Watcher's presence became undeniable again. A flicker of movement near the broken edge of the compound caught Ethan's eye. "Did you see that?" Ethan whispered. Marcus nodded, gripping his weapon tighter. "We're not alone." They moved cautiously toward the source, but the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only footprints in the dust, fresh footprints leading toward the city ruins. The gatekeepers were unsettled. "Someone's playing a dangerous game," their leader said grimly. "Using the dead to mask their moves." Ethan knew the stakes had risen beyond simple survival. Whoever this watcher was, they weren't just observing, they were manipulating. And that meant the real danger wasn't the undead but the people who had learned to hide in the shadows. Back in the Enclave, Ethan confronted Marcus and Sarah. "We need to find out who's behind this," Ethan said. "If they can control the undead or the survivors, we're all at risk." Sarah shivered but nodded. "I've heard rumors about a group controlling small packs of zombies, using them as weapons. If that's true, this could be worse than anything we've faced." Determined, they formed a small team to investigate. The plan was simple but perilous: follow the Watcher's trail into the heart of the city, uncover the truth, and return. The next morning, with supplies gathered and weapons ready, Ethan, Marcus, and Sarah slipped past the East Terminal's gates, stepping back into the ruined city. The streets seemed to close in around them, buildings towering like ghosts, windows empty, eyes staring down. Every step echoed with a tension that tightened their nerves. As they traced the footprints, signs of recent activity emerged: makeshift camps, discarded weapons, and eerie symbols painted on walls. Finally, in the shadow of a collapsed skyscraper, they found it, a hidden camp, surrounded by the undead, but strangely controlled. The zombies moved sluggishly, herded by faint signals from crude devices hanging on poles. Ethan's heart sank. This was no random horde, it was a weapon. Before they could react, figures emerged from the camp's shadows, a group of survivors with cold eyes and hardened faces. The leader stepped forward, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile. "Welcome to the New Order," he said. "In this world, power belongs to those who can control the dead." Ethan, Marcus, and Sarah exchanged tense glances. The game had changed. The shadows had a new master, and the fight for survival was only beginning. Would you like me to continue with Part 7? The story's intensity will ramp up as the survivors confront this dangerous new enemy. The scarred leader's cold smile faded as Ethan, Marcus, and Sarah stood firm. The hidden camp was a fortress of control, where the dead were no longer mindless monsters but instruments of fear and power. "We can't let them keep this," Ethan whispered. "If they control the dead, the East Terminal is next." The leader's eyes glittered with menace. "Try to stop us, and you'll find out what true terror means." Without warning, a low whistle pierced the air. The controlled zombies surged forward like a living wall, but Ethan's team was ready. Bullets and makeshift weapons met the advancing horde in a desperate fight. The battle was brutal, the undead relentless, the survivors' determination fierce. Ethan ducked behind a broken car, breath ragged as he watched Marcus fend off a staggering zombie with a steel pipe. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "We need to break their control devices." Nodding, Ethan and Marcus fought their way toward the signal poles, dodging zombie attacks and hostile survivors alike. Marcus swung his pipe at a device hanging from a pole, smashing it with a satisfying crack. Instantly, the zombies nearest them faltered, confusion flickering in their vacant eyes. Encouraged, the others followed suit, destroying the remaining devices one by one. As each signal fell, the undead lost their unnatural coordination, becoming the aimless threats they had always been. But just as victory seemed near, the leader charged, brandishing a cruel blade. Ethan met him with a fierce struggle, the clash of metal and desperation echoing across the ruined street. In a final surge, Ethan disarmed the man, forcing him to the ground. The leader's gaze hardened. "This isn't over." Breathing heavily, Ethan signaled Sarah and Marcus to retreat. They couldn't stay, not with reinforcements likely on the way. Back at the East Terminal, the survivors prepared for the inevitable. The knowledge that someone could control the dead shifted everything. The city's shadows had grown deeper, darker. That night, as Ethan stood watch, he stared out over the broken skyline, the weight of survival heavier than ever. The Watcher's game wasn't just about the dead anymore, it was about control, fear, and who would claim the future of this shattered world. Ready for the final part, Part 8? It will bring resolution, with intense suspense and a hopeful glimpse toward what lies ahead. The night air was thick with tension as the survivors of East Terminal braced for the coming storm. Word had spread quickly, the scarred leader and his followers would not retreat easily. Control over the dead had shifted the balance, and the fight for survival was now a war for freedom itself. Ethan stood beside Marcus and Sarah on the highest battlement, eyes scanning the horizon where the city's ruins blurred into darkness. The distant groans of zombies mixed with faint footsteps, an approaching threat, both undead and human. "We can't let them break through," Marcus said grimly, tightening his grip on his weapon. Sarah's gaze flickered to Ethan. "We have to be smarter than before. Use the city to our advantage." Plans were made swiftly. Booby traps set along narrow streets, barricades reinforced with scavenged metal, and lookouts posted on every rooftop. The survivors were ready, but the price of failure was unthinkable. As dawn crept over the horizon, a shadow moved beyond the gates, a wave of the undead, controlled once more by the scarred leader's cruel devices, accompanied by the ruthless scavengers who had embraced darkness. The battle was fierce and unforgiving. Ethan led the defense, pushing back the unnatural horde with every ounce of strength. Each fallen friend fueled their resolve, every breath a fight against despair. Amid the chaos, Ethan spotted the scarred leader advancing, his twisted smile replaced by a mask of desperation. Their eyes locked, two souls fighting not just for survival but for the future of a broken world. With a final, desperate struggle, Ethan disarmed the man and crushed the last control device beneath his boot. The zombies nearby faltered, collapsing into aimless confusion. Silence fell, heavy and profound. The scarred leader lay defeated, but the survivors knew the battle was never truly over. The city still held its secrets, its shadows waiting for the next threat to emerge. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light over the battered ruins, Ethan looked toward the horizon with a flicker of hope. "We survived," he said quietly. Marcus nodded. "And we'll keep fighting, for the living, for what's left of humanity." Sarah smiled faintly. "In the shadows of dead America, there's still a chance to rebuild." Together, they stepped forward into the dawn, uncertain, but unbroken. The journey was far from over, but in this new world, survival meant more than avoiding the dead. It meant reclaiming life from the ruins. And with every step, hope grew stronger. If you want, I can help you create a summary or promotional text for your YouTube audiobook based on this story.